We began to go swiftly downhill. The physical downhill wasn't as quick as the psychological. My mother was, above everything else, a proud woman, and it took its toll on her that she was accepting charity, and her feelings were communicated to us. She would speak sharply to the man at the grocery store for padding the bill, telling him that she wasn't ignorant, and he didn't like that. She would talk back sharply to the state welfare people, telling them that she was a grown woman, able to raise her children, that it wasn't necessary for them to keep coming around so much, meddling in our lives, and they didn't like that. But the monthly welfare check was their pass. They acted as if they owned us, as if we were their private property. As much as my mother would have liked to, she couldn't keep them out. She would get particularly incensed when they began insisting upon drawing us older children aside, one at a time, out on the porch or somewhere, and asking us questions or telling us things against our mother and against each other. We couldn't understand why. If the state was willing to give us packages of meat, sacks of potatoes and fruit, and cans of all kinds of things our mother obviously hated to accept, we really couldn't understand. What I later understood was that my mother was making a desperate effort to preserve her pride and ours. Pride was just about all we had to preserve, for by 1934, we really began to suffer. This was about the worst Depression year, and no one we knew had enough to eat or live on. Some old family friends visited us now and then. At first they brought food. Though it was charity, my mother took it. Wilfred was working to help. My mother was working when she could find any kind of job. In Lansing there was a bakery store. For a nickel, a couple of us children would buy a tall flour sack of day-old bread and cookies and then walk the 2 miles back out into the country to our house. Our mother knew, I guess, dozens of ways to cook things with bread and out of bread. Stewed tomatoes with bread. Maybe that would be a meal. Something like French toast if we had any eggs. Bread pudding, sometimes with raisins in it. If we got a hold of some hamburger, it came to the table more bread than meat. The cookies that were always in the sack with the bread we just gobbled down straight. But there were times when there wasn't even a nickel, and we would be so hungry we were dizzy. My mother would boil a big pot of dandelion greens, and we would eat that. I remember that some small-minded neighbor put it out, and children would tease us that we ate fried grass. Sometimes, if we were lucky, we would have oatmeal or cornmeal mush 3 times a day, or mush in the morning and cornbread at night. Filbert and I were grown up enough to quit fighting long enough to take the .22 caliber rifle that had been our father's and shoot rabbits that some white neighbors up or down the road would buy. I know now they just did it to help us because they, like everyone, shot their own rabbits. Sometimes I remember Filbert and I would take little Reginald along with us. He wasn't very strong, but he was always so proud to be along. We would trap muskrats out in a little creek in back of our house, and we would lie quiet until unsuspecting bullfrogs appeared, and we would spear them, cut off their legs, and sell them for a nickel a pair to people who lived up and down the road. The whites seemed less restricted in their dietary tastes. Then in about late 1934, I would guess, something began to happen. Some kind of psychological deterioration hit our family circle and began to eat away our pride. Perhaps it was the constant tangible evidence that we were destitute. We had known other families who had gone on relief. We had known without anyone in our home ever expressing it that we had felt prouder not to be at the depot where the free food was passed out. And now we were among them. At school, the on-relief finger suddenly was pointed at us too, and sometimes it was said aloud. It seemed that everything to eat in our house was stamped not to be sold. All welfare food bore this stamp to keep the recipients from selling it. It's a wonder we didn't come to think of not to be sold as a brand name. Sometimes, instead of going home from school, I walked the 2 miles up the road to Lansing. I began drifting from store to store, hanging around outside where things like Apples were displayed in boxes and barrels and baskets, and I would watch my chance and steal me a treat. You know what a treat was to me? Anything. Or I began to drop in about dinner time at the home of some family that we knew. I knew that they knew exactly why I was there, but they never embarrassed me by letting on. They would invite me to stay for supper, and I would stuff myself. Especially, I liked to drop in and visit the Gohannes' home. They were nice, older people and great churchgoers. I had watched them lead the jumping and shouting when my father preached. They had living with them, they were raising him, a nephew whom everyone called Big Boy, and he and I got along fine. Also living with the Gohanneses was old Mrs. Adcock, who went with them to church. She was always trying to help anybody she could, visiting anyone she heard was sick, carrying them something. She was the one who years later would tell me something that I remembered a long time. Malcolm, there's one thing I like about you. You're no good, but you don't try to hide it. You are not a hypocrite. The more I began to stay away from home and visit people and steal from the stores, the more aggressive I became in my inclinations. I never wanted to wait for anything. I was growing up fast, physically more so than mentally. As I began to be more recognized around the town, I started to become aware of the peculiar attitude of white people toward me. I sensed it had to do with my father. It was an adult version of what several white children had said at school in hints or sometimes in the open, which really expressed what their parents had said, that the Black Legion or the Klan had killed my father, and the insurance company had pulled a fast one in refusing to pay my mother the policy money. When I began to get caught stealing now and then, the state welfare people began to focus on me when they came to our house. I can't remember how I first became aware that they were talking of taking me away. What I first remember along that line was my mother raising a storm about being able to bring up her own children. She would whip me for stealing, and I would try to alarm the neighborhood with my yelling. One thing I have always been proud of is that I never raised my hand against my mother. In the summertime, at night, in addition to all the other things we did, some of us boys would slip out down the road or across the pastures and go cooning watermelons. White people always associated watermelons with Negroes, and they sometimes called Negroes coons, among all the other names, and so stealing watermelons became cooning them. If white boys were doing it, it implied that they were only acting like Negroes. Whites have always hidden or justified all the guilts they could by ridiculing or blaming Negroes. One Halloween night, I remember that a bunch of us were out tipping over those old country outhouses, and one old farmer, I guess he had tipped over enough in his day, had set a trap for us. Always you sneak up from behind the outhouse, then you gang together and push it to tip it over. This farmer had taken his outhouse off the hole and set it just in front of the hole. Well, we came sneaking up in single file in the darkness, and the two white boys in the lead fell down into the outhouse hole neck deep. They smelled so bad, it was all we could stand to get them out, and that finished us all for that Halloween. I had just missed falling in myself. The whites were so used to taking the lead, this time it had really gotten them in the hole. Thus, in various ways, I learned various things. I picked strawberries, and though I can't recall what I got per crate for picking, I remember that after working hard all one day, I wound up with about $1, which was a whole lot of money in those times. I was so hungry, I didn't know what to do. I was walking away toward town with visions of buying something good to eat, and this older white boy I knew, Richard Dixon, came up and asked me if I wanted to match nickels. He had plenty of change for my $1. In about a half an hour, he had all the change back, including my $1, and instead of going to town to buy something, I went home with nothing, and I was bitter. But that was nothing compared to what I felt when I found out later that he had cheated. There is a way that you can catch and hold a nickel and make it come up the way you want. This was my first lesson about gambling. If you see somebody winning all the time, he isn't gambling, he's cheating. Later on in life, if I were continuously losing in any gambling situation, I would watch very closely. It's like the Negro in America, seeing the white man win all the time. He's a professional gambler. He has all the cards and the odds stacked on his side, and he has always dealt to our people from the bottom of the deck. About this time, my mother began to be visited by some Seventh-day Adventists who had moved into a house not too far down the road from us. They would talk to her for hours at a time and leave booklets and leaflets and magazines for her to read. She read them, and Wilfred, who had started back to school after we had begun to get the relief food supplies, also read a lot. His head was forever in some book. Before long, my mother spent much time with the Adventists. It's my belief that what mostly influenced her was that they had even more diet restrictions than she had taught and practiced with us. Like us, they were against eating rabbit and pork. They followed the Mosaic dietary laws. They ate nothing of the flesh without a split hoof or that didn't chew a cud. We began to go with my mother to the Adventist meetings that were held further out in the country. For us children, I know that the major attraction was the good food they served. But we listened too. There were a handful of Negroes from small towns in the area, but I would say that it was 99% white people. The Adventists felt that they were living at the end of time, that the world soon was coming to an end. But they were the friendliest white people I had ever seen. In some ways, though, we children noticed, and when we were back at home discussed, that they were different from us, such as the lack of enough seasoning in their food and the different way that white people smelled. Meanwhile, the state welfare people kept after my mother. By now, she didn't make it any secret that she hated them and didn't want them in her house. But they exerted their right to come, and I have many, many times reflected upon how, talking to us children, they began to plant the seeds of division in our minds. They would ask us such things as who was smarter than the other, and they would ask me why I was so different. I think that they felt that getting children into foster homes was a legitimate part of their function, and the result would be less troublesome, however they went about it. And when my mother fought them, they went after her. First, through me. I was the first target. I stole. That implied I wasn't being taken care of by my mother. All of us were mischievous at some time or another, I more so than any of the rest. Filbert and I kept a battle going, and this was just one of a dozen things that kept building up the pressure on my mother. I'm not sure just how or when the idea was first dropped by the welfare workers that our mother was losing her mind. But I can distinctly remember hearing crazy applied to her by them when they learned that the Negro farmer who was in the next house down the road from us had offered to give us some butchered pork, a whole pig, maybe even two of them, and she had refused. We all heard them call my mother crazy to her face for refusing good meat. It meant nothing to them, even when she explained that we had never eaten pork, that it was against her religion as a Seventh-day Adventist. They were as vicious as vultures. They had no feelings, understanding, compassion, or respect for my mother. They told us she's crazy for refusing food. Right then was when our home, our unity, began to disintegrate. We were having a hard time, and I wasn't helping. But we could have made it. We could have stayed together. As bad as I was, as much trouble and worry as I caused my mother, I loved her. The state people, we found out, had interviewed the Gohannes family, and the Gohanneses had said that they would take me into their home. My mother threw a fit, though, when she heard that, and the homewreckers took cover for a while. It was about this time that the large, dark man from Lansing began visiting. I don't remember how or where he and my mother met. It may have been through some mutual friends. I don't remember what the man's profession was. In 1935 in Lansing, Negroes didn't have anything you could call a profession. But the man, big and black, looked something like my father. I can remember his name, but there's no need to mention it. He was a single man, and my mother was a widow, only 36 years old. The man was independent. Naturally, she admired that. She was having a hard time disciplining us, and a big man's presence alone would help. And if she had a man to provide, it would send the state people away forever. We all understood without ever saying much about it, or at least we had no objection. We took it in stride, even with some amusement among us, that when the man came, our mother would be all dressed up in the best that she had. She was still a good-looking woman, and she would act differently, light-hearted and laughing, as we hadn't seen her act in years. It went on for about a year, I guess, and then about 1936 or 1937, the man from Lansing jilted my mother suddenly. He just stopped coming to see her. From what I later understood, he finally backed away from taking on the responsibility of those 8 mouths to feed. He was afraid of so many of us. To this day, I can see the trap that my mother was in, saddled with all of us, and I can also understand why he would shun taking on such a tremendous responsibility. But it was a terrible shock to her. It was the beginning of the end of reality for my mother. When she began to sit around and walk around talking to herself, almost as though she was unaware that we were there, it became increasingly terrifying. The state people saw her weakening, and that was when they began the definite steps to take me away from home. They began to tell me how nice it was going to be at the Gohannes home, where the Gohanneses and Big Boy and Mrs. Adcock had all said how much they liked me and would like to have me live with them. I liked all of them, too. But I didn't want to leave Wilford. I looked up to and admired my big brother. I didn't want to leave Hilda, who was like my second mother, or Filbert. Even in our fighting, there was a feeling of brotherly union. Or Reginald, especially, who was weak with his hernia condition, and who looked up to me as his big brother, who looked out for him, as I looked up to Wilfred. I had nothing either against the babies, Yvonne, Wesley, and Robert. As my mother talked to herself more and more, she gradually became less responsive to us, and less responsible. The house became less tidy. We began to be more unkempt, and usually now, Hilda cooked. We children watched our anchor giving way. It was something terrible that you couldn't get your hands on, yet you couldn't get away from. It was a sensing that something bad was going to happen. We younger ones leaned more and more heavily on the relative strength of Wilfred and Hilda, who were the oldest. When finally I was sent to the Gohannes home, at least in a surface way, I was glad. I remember that when I left home with the state man, my mother said one thing: "Don't let them feed him any pig." It was better in a lot of ways at the Gohannes. Big Boy and I shared his room together, and we hit it off nicely. He just wasn't the same as my blood brothers. The Gohanneses were very religious people. Big Boy and I attended church with them. They were sanctified holy rollers now. The preachers and the congregations jumped even higher and shouted even louder than the Baptists I had known. They sang at the top of their lungs and swayed back and forth and cried and moaned and beat on tambourines and chanted. It was spooky, with ghosts and spirituals and haints seeming to be in the very atmosphere when finally we all came out of the church going back home. The Gohanneses and Mrs. Adcock loved to go fishing, and some Saturdays Big Boy and I would go along. I had changed schools now to Lansing's West Junior High School. It was right in the heart of the Negro community, and a few white kids were there, but Big Boy didn't mix much with any of our schoolmates, and I didn't either. And when we went fishing, neither he or I liked the idea of just sitting and waiting for the fish to jerk the cork under the water or make the tight line quiver when we fished that way. I figured there should have been some smarter way to get the fish, though we never discovered what it might be. Mr. Gohanus was close cronies with some other men who, some Saturdays, would take me and Big Boy with them hunting rabbits. I had my father's .22 caliber rifle. My mother had said it was all right to take it with me. The old men had a set rabbit hunting strategy that they had always used. Usually when a dog jumps a rabbit, and the rabbit gets away, that rabbit will always somehow instinctively run in a circle and return sooner or later past the very spot where he originally was jumped. Well, the old men would just sit and wait in hiding somewhere for the rabbit to come back, then get their shots at him. I got to thinking about it, and finally I thought of a plan. I would separate from them and Big Boy, and I would go to a point where I figured that the rabbit returning would have to pass me first. It worked like magic. I began to get 3 or 4 rabbits before they got one. The astonishing thing was that none of the old men ever figured out why. They outdid themselves exclaiming what a sure shot I was. I was about 12 then. All I had done was to improve on their strategy, and it was the beginning of a very important lesson in life, that any time you find someone more successful than you are, especially when you're both engaged in the same business, you know they're doing something that you aren't. I would return home to visit fairly often. Sometimes Big Boy and one or another or both of the Gohanuses would go with me, sometimes not. I would be glad when some of them did go because it made the ordeal easier. Soon the state people were making plans to take over all of my mother's children. She talked to herself nearly all of the time now, and there was a crowd of new white people entering the picture, always asking questions. They would even visit me at the Gohanuses. They would ask me questions out on the porch or sitting out in their cars. Eventually, my mother suffered a complete breakdown, and the court orders were finally signed. They took her to the state mental hospital at Kalamazoo. It was 70-some miles from Lansing, about an hour and a half on the bus. A Judge McClellan in Lansing had authority over me and all of my brothers and sisters. We were state children, court wards. He had the full say-so over us, a white man in charge of a black man's children. Nothing but legal, modern slavery, however kindly intentioned. My mother remained in the same hospital at Kalamazoo for about 26 years. Later, when I was still growing up in Michigan, I would go to visit her every so often. Nothing that I can imagine could have moved me as deeply as seeing her pitiful state. In 1963, we got my mother out of the hospital, and she now lives there in Lansing with Filbert and his family. It was so much worse than if it had been a physical sickness for which a cause might be known, medicine given, a cure effected. Every time I visited her, when finally they led her, a case, a number, back inside from where we had been sitting together, I felt worse. My last visit, when I knew I would never come to see her again, there, was in 1952. I was 27. My brother Filbert had told me that on his last visit, she had recognized him somewhat in spots, he said. But she didn't recognize me at all. She stared at me. She didn't know who I was. Her mind, when I tried to talk to reach her, was somewhere else. I asked, "Mama, do you know what day it is?" She said, staring, "All the people have gone." I can't describe how I felt. The woman who had brought me into the world and nursed me and advised me and chastised me and loved me didn't know me. It was as if I was trying to walk up the side of a hill of feathers. I looked at her, I listened to her talk, but there was nothing I could do. I truly believe that if ever a state social agency destroyed a family, it destroyed ours. We wanted and tried to stay together. Our home didn't have to be destroyed. But the welfare, the courts, and their doctor gave us the 1, 2, 3 punch. And ours was not the only case of this kind. I knew I wouldn't be back to see my mother again because it could make me a very vicious and dangerous person. Knowing how they had looked at us as numbers and as a case in their book, not as human beings, and knowing that my mother in there was a statistic that didn't have to be, that existed because of a society's failure, hypocrisy, greed, and lack of mercy and compassion. Hence have I no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. I have rarely talked to anyone about my mother, for I believe that I am capable of killing a person without hesitation who happened to make the wrong kind of remark about my mother, so I purposely don't make any opening for some fool to step into. Back then, our family was destroyed. In 1937, Wilfred and Hilda were old enough so that the state let them stay on their own in the big 4-room house that my father had built. Filbert was placed with another family in Lansing, a Mrs. Hackett, while Reginald and Wesley went to live with a family called Williams, who were friends of my mother's. And Yvonne and Robert went to live with a West Indian family named McGuire. Separated though we were, all of us maintained fairly close touch around Lansing, in school and out, whenever we could get together. Despite the artificially created separation and distance between us, we still remained very close in our feelings towards each other.